You are listening to the Neurocareers Doing the Impossible podcast with Dr. K, episode number 21, part 2. Dear Neurocareers podcast listeners, welcome to the second part of our podcast episode with Marco Mazzanti. Today, we are continuing our exciting conversation with this linguist who has a particular interest in psycholinguistics. And today, Marco will be sharing with us best strategies for language learning and much more. So please stay tuned. As you were talking, I got very curious. So you said that in the language, especially in the grammar of the language, in the tenses we're using, there is a reflection of this linearity of our current thinking. It might change over time, but we have past, present, and future. You also mentioned that there are some civilizations, or the were civilizations, where the time was circular. So is there any evidence that those civilizations use different grammatical rules, or they represented the circularity in their language, which now is very different from how we are using language or how it is represented in our language?
I reckon that depends on the structure of the brain. If I couldn't be able to think about my past and about my future, I would probably want a one-dimension type of language, a language without past tenses, future tenses. It depends, of course, I think, on the area involved in our brain. It depends on our biology, as I said before, on the perception of the reality. Well, I was thinking while talking about the films, and I was thinking about what we said about technology, devices, microchips in our brain. I can imagine that in the future, thanks to this technology, we could develop our brain, the human brain could be maybe developed in a different way. Why not? Special chips inside our brains, or something, a brain-like chips in a computer. So by a computer with biocomponents could be able to concept multi-dimensional sort of languages. It's interesting. We can imagine lots of possibility of what languages, the aspect, the sounds, the structure of a language. So I think technology could help us in the future through something brain-like microchips, hardware with biocomponents. It would be interesting, but of course, a computer, a machine needs to have, for instance, an idea of itself. As you know, there is the scale of needs by Maslow, for instance. No, I think a computer should have a scale of needs in order to represent itself. And of course, a language, since a language is made up of pragmatics, of course, too. So it's very interesting. Human beings ought to get the control of it, of course. We can imagine a lot of interesting things. Yeah, this sounds very speculative, I know. But anyway, as you know, novels, science fiction help us to concept the reality. Imagination is very important. And why not to get the imagination involved, to develop, to broaden to get wider the view of language. Why not?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It only can help us. Even imagining all other possible species, how they can communicate, it can help us to develop new ways even of communication.
Yeah.
If we imagine this. Absolutely. And one more question on this topic. For example, if we take into account such language as Chinese language. They don't use past or future. Mostly everything is structured in the present. Is this an indication of using the time concept or perceiving the time differently or not?
No, I don't think so. I think, of course, Chinese is a language in which there are particles through which human organisms are able to represent the past and the future. It happens in German and Italian too, for instance, and in Russian too. When using the perfective form of a verb, the perfective, we can conjugate like the present, but the meaning is a future meaning. In Italian, we have, of course, a future tense, but we can also use a preposition or an adverb to express the tense, the representation of when something happens. So it doesn't matter if it is a form, a verb, an endings, or a preposition or particle. It depends on the way we can just elaborate this, the fact of the presence, and the fact is that there are lots of preposition, particle. So that's not an ending; it's a preposition, and the boundaries between preposition, postposition, endings, prefix, suffixes, the difference between a preposition, a postposition, an ending, a suffix, prefixes, and so on, is often not so strong. What matters inside our mind. So, Chinese, Russian, Italian, German, Hungarian, Spanish, French, and like, they underlie a common future. We have to discover and figure out inside the neural connection in our brain. All is related to the capability, to the capacity to think. But what? A preposition, a verb, an ending, it doesn't matter. Just the language and its form. And they are just a representation. What matters is inside our brain. To me, it's very important to say that there are no grammar rules in the strict sense of the term. I would be able to think, to write everything with all the incorrect forms of the language. But the fact I am able, I can express is a capability in our mind. As a linguist, we have to figure out what happens inside the hemispheres of our brain. Grammar is often just a representation. It's not something organic. It's a representation. As a linguist, I won't say what is correct is incorrect. I would indicate why it happens. Your purpose, of course, it's very important in order to speak with confidence, with ease. I ought to know grammar rules, of course, but anyway, a linguist gets deeper and deeper, as far as I'm concerned to say.
Yeah, and that's very interesting that you are talking about this, that the grammar, this is a representation. It's not something natural that comes with the language. I would like us to focus on the last part of our conversation, which is related to you actually helping people to learn languages. I noticed this tendency in the past to start studying language with the grammar and then move further. However, right now, the tendency changed, and now we see more immersive language. We just start speaking, trying to understand very naturally, and then already the grammar comes in, and also it becomes more a natural process. So, how would you explain that change? Maybe it's related to our understanding how language is represented in our brain, and what are the best practices of learning language? Maybe also that you are using with people when you are helping them to learn language, and how those practices maybe are based on information about how our brain works.
Yeah, people often see grammar as a static configuration of rules, but languages are a dynamic system. So it's good to study grammar rules, but we have to understand that rules can change over the time, and they aren't statics but dynamic. I often invite my students to listen to dialogues, to audiobook. They couldn't at the beginning. They won't comprehend anything. It's normal, but the brain, the mind, they will be training their neural cells to develop more and more the capability to react, to absorb, to get used to hearing this kind of sounds, of course, to receive patterns, since, as I said, grammar is just a grouping of patterns we describe through pages. And it's useful to get to know way grammar rules, of course. It's very important. But it's important to highlight the languages is not the languages we want to speak, the languages we want to master, where with this, they are alive. I'm not learning ancient Greek or Latin. I'm learning a language which is still alive, which is still dynamic. So let's have a look at the language in the daily life. What happens, for instance, when seeing a film? I won't understand anything at the beginning, but anyway, my mind will be getting used to understanding, to receiving all of this step by step. And as I said in our conversation before, why did I say that it's very important, write with a pen or pencil? Why copying, for instance, a text every day? Let us be more confident with the language, the form of the words, the sounds. When writing a word, I can imagine the sounds. I don't only write, but even I listen in my mind the sound. So the processes are multiple in my mind. So while studying a static grammar rule as a stone, it wouldn't be so useful if avoiding listening to films, to dialogue, to novels, audiobook, of course, and so on. So by the time I was a student at university, I started to write every day and to listen to films every day. I would repeat the words step by step in my mind or alone on myself, not not on public transport, but alone. When, for instance, when working, while listening an audiobook, it was very useful. But anyway, I wanted to say that everyone has his or her own method. I don't think there is the perfect method to learn a language. The most important thing is considering taking into account the whole spectrum of what a language is. So, writing, listening, pragmatics, so the way we address to each other. So, languages are codes, yeah, but not static codes. For instance, when talking to you in this moment, for instance, I'm not speaking so fluently since I think about what saying. I'm thinking how the concept could be more clear. Everyone has his or her own way to speak, to write, like our personality. Languages have their own personality and they are adapt to our personality, and our personality affect the language. Is in this case is a circular process. In this case, the time is aligned, but the processes between languages and our representation, our way to be, is circular, is an interaction between genetic feature, genetic aspects, and the environment affect our way to be, our personality. Language plays a very important role in this. So, when helping students study a new language, the first thing I like to say is forget studying a language like Latin or ancient Greek. It's a living language. If you want to master, if you want to get a very good command of Russian or master this language, where it is Russian or Spanish or English or Italian, and like, you have to dive into the ocean of all languages. So the grammar rules, they are very important, but they are just a single part, a shard of this massive universe. Why we could name it this way. Languages are a universe. That's just a metaphor, of course. The mind, the brain, everything starts from our brains. Languages are within us. It's difficult to master a language at the beginning since adults tend to overthink the real aspects. For instance, I want to use this word because I find it so precious, elegant, but an overthinking, it could be related to the personality of the individual. But anyway, the languages are not only precious, noble words or slang words. Languages are a huge grouping of elements we have to consider in order to get a good master of this language, of the language we are studying, we are learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And this conversation brings me to the discussion that we had recently on a LinkedIn when a neuromathematician wrote that he has challenges learning a new spoken language. However, at the same time, he doesn't have such problems in learning programming languages. So, what can be the reason for this, and what are the differences between studying a programming language and a spoken and written language?
Well, programming languages are said to be simpler, The fact is that programming languages aren't spoken languages. At this moment, of course, I don't know whether we will be having a sort of spoken programming languages in the future. Maybe, I don't know. But anyway, we tend to learn programming languages the same way we study languages with a grammar book. And it finishes there. I don't to take care about my language skills in speaking, listening. It's just a written code and a code which is anyway simpler. So once I have learned a code, the syntax, the morphology, that's all. I don't have to speak this programming language. I don't have to listen to this programming language. I need to write, I need to comprehend, to understand the logic, the mechanisms of this syntax and of this particular morphology. But that's not a human language. So when studying a language, that's the reason why students, after studying, after learning, after writing text, they are not able to speak with ease. They aren't able to understand everything the other person is talking about because they study people in general. We study languages just as a code and a grouping of particles, parts to conjugate, to junction. It could be through programming languages, but not with human languages. I feel very curious about programming languages. I don't mean that programming languages are easy to learn. On the contrary, they could be hard to learn, to master. To get a good programmer, you need to practice the same way a student needs to do when studying Russian or English or Spanish, German, Japanese, Chinese at university. So practice. So we need to take into account that a code, since languages are code, human languages and programming languages are code, and code are to get studied with attention and taking into account, considering everything of what they made up of. But anyway, of course, at the moment, nowadays, learning human languages is harder than learning a programming languages, since there is no phonology, there is no pragmatics. Well, anyway, it could be very primordial. But anyway, pragmatics is unique in the human species. We could create a computer machines using and developing their own pragmatics. Why not? But at today, we have nothing of it. So to sum up, I think learning programming languages that's the reason, since learning programming language tends to be easier. It's not easy, but anyway, tends to be easier than learning a human languages. If I want just to learn, for instance, Hungarian, and if I feel happy just by reading and writing, that's fine, of course. I will be able to read, to listen to write Hungarian, but I won't be able to express myself to the line, to the representation of myself, to speak anyway, to have a conversation. So there are many levels, and human language has many levels Anyway, programming languages were simpler in the past. They will be trickier in the future, but also, I think, easier than learning a human language.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very logical explanation. What about people who are called polyglots? People who know from 10 to 55 languages. And they just do it just for fun. They study languages
Hmm.
and they know and can operate so many of them. Is anything different in their neural substrates of a language? Maybe there are some technologies that can help people to learn languages. As we talked a lot about the technologies, for example, there are some technologies that can provide certain words. It's mostly for word learning during sleep, during certain phases of brain activity, which actually helps people to learn words even while they're asleep. So, if you can comment on this.
Yeah, of course. They are incredible. They can speak so many languages. Of course, the capability to master lots of languages, and by lots, I mean 20, 30, 40 languages. It means that these people have solicited their neural cells in order to develop the area involved in listening, in speaking. It's like when you see a swimmer in the pool, they swim so fast. And how could that possible? They have while learning, we develop our neural cells and our neural population, and it depends on their motivation. It depends on many factors, such as, for instance, of course, motivation, training. By training, I mean listening to, writing, reading, speaking, and so on. And of course, it depends on the fact the motivation and also the representation they have of these languages, the purpose they have in life. For instance, my personal goals uh, to get a wide knowledge of language faculty, languages, mechanisms. My language skills, for instance, my understanding, my listening to, my way of speaking, my fluency, they are depends, for instance, on my mood, the way I see myself that day. It depends on many factors, and learning lots of languages is very interesting. Technology could help us understand more and more what happens in the brain of polyglots. I don't consider myself a polyglot since I can speak five, maybe six languages, but my fluency depends on many factors, such as I said, of my mood, my listening, my speaking, the representation of myself. And then we have to consider also the memory system. We well know many regions in the brain are involved in setting, in storing the information in the brain. The cerebellum too would be involved in this activity. All in the brain is connected. But as I said, we tend to consider just an area, a sole function and just two or three connection, but everything in the brain is interconnected very deep. And I could imagine that in the future, the technology will be helping us get the learning faster, but anyway, taking care our physiology, of course. That's not possible to learn a language in 3 months, for instance. Oh, okay. I can, of course, after 3 months, I will be able to have a basic conversation, maybe a good pronunciation. Why not? But since there are many levels of the language, pragmatics level, 3 months or 4 or 6 months aren't enough to learn a language. So I think technology will be helpful to get more comfortable. The memorization, I think, the stimuli. I don't know, but as for me, for instance, the sound A, the vowel A in Italian, we say A. And when pronouncing the vowel A in Italian, A, I imagine a color, red. If I say the Russian A, it's not like in Italian, Papa, ma Papa. I can imagine a dark red. The sound of the vowel I in Italian for me is yellow. In Russian is light yellow, since the E in Italian, E in Russian is something thinner in Russian. And I can imagine a color for each one of the letter and the vowel in particular, and numbers. And this capability could be helpful in technology. Technology, by adding a color to every sounds or even to every endings. For instance, the genitive endings, for instance, could have a color for the gender, the masculine, the feminine, the neuter. Each of them could have a color, and visual software, a visual technology could be helpful to help people with this kind of this capability. As for me, I found very useful while learning languages at university, since every endings, every preposition had a color. I don't know how many people have this capability. I think everyone, anyway. Everyone of this planet have a brain, and the brain is usually set the same way, more or less. Of course, there is a spectrum of the brain is organized, but anyway, we are all human beings. And I think that taking into account every shade of the capability, the personal capability, could be very helpful with technology. So anyway, a colorful, not gray, but or black and white grammar, but a colorful grammar, a colorful technology, and technology stimulating the imagination. I mean, it's very important. I have here home lots of book, a grammar book. I have also a very old book, a Russian grammar book. There are no images, just text. It's interesting, but that stimulates the imagination. I'm sure that it would stimulate the imagination of learners. But anyway, today, with that technology, we can do more. So with color, with special glasses, our brain will be getting used to feeling and seeing, watching. The stimulation will be very important, but tailored. Tailored, I mean the capability of each one of the learners. Yeah, yeah. Technology could be very useful. Yeah, to impact on our life while learning a language, of course. Yet, this impact should have calibrated, tailored, of course.
Yeah, to each person individually. Yes, and you mentioned this today already, that that's the most important approach.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Application on the smartphone devices and applications to learn languages. They are very stimulating. They are very they are fun. They are very useful. I prefer, if I was a student, if I were a student at university at the beginning of this of course, I would prefer a book or an application to study and improve my language skills instead of having and reading an old book with no color, with no color. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
Our senses, our perception is very important. The most important thing is that avoiding a cocktail party. A cocktail party with too many sounds, when the environment is too loud, too
Noises.
noisy. Uh, well, it's not good for learning.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, in this case, a lot of stimuli could be annoying, and they could get the studies very so stressful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
A good measure of stimuli.
Marco, what are your future plans in your psycholinguistic quest and learning languages? What are you planning in your next maybe 2 to 5 years?
I keep on studying. I keep on studying on my own, and I decided to learn. We were we was talking about them before. I decided to learn programming languages. I have been always I've always been curious about the way a machine, a computer, may be able to communicate, to interact with us. So I will be starting this new journey very soon. At the same time, I will be keeping learning, researching, helping students study languages. It will be challenging, of course. I reckon that in this period in which the technology plays a very important role in our life, and it's very demanding, of course. Technology is demanding, and our life is demanding. We need technology to go farther through this century to understand how things function, work. So I see a connection between what I study at university and, on the other hand, what we can find before us. Like in this moment, a computer. It will be very exciting, I think, and very interesting. I'm sure I will discover, figure out lots of deep connection, deep links to write about or LinkedIn, lots of interesting things. Anyway, learning and discovering new things every day is very important. Our mind needs to get trained every day.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, it promotes neuroplasticity.
The neuroplasticity, yeah, absolutely.
The more we learn, yes.
Yeah, maybe in the future, as I said, in 50 years or a century, computers will be provided with a sort of softwares or hardwares, biohardwares with neuroplasticity. Why not? It could be fine. I want to think that it will be fine to get our minds, our knowledge wider. And as you said, yeah, the neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is very important. Learning every day and understanding how languages work. Speaking, I usually say that the students I help study languages, learning, writing, listening to music or audiobook, develop your neuroplasticity. Our brain works even when sleeping. My mind, for instance, thinks about languages and the language faculty and mechanisms. While for instance, I read a book, while watching a film, while strolling, for instance, while driving, my mind, in an unconscious way, the mind of each of the human beings on the planet keeps on working. That's why we often find a solution and during such a weird moments, for instance, while driving and thinking about the road, I suddenly find the solution of, for instance, a problem. And that's why our brain keeps on working in every moment, and the languages too. So, for instance, classes don't finish after closing a book. No, languages keep on working even after closing the book, even after switching the computer off, after watching a film. We have an incredible, a very interesting engine in our head.
Yeah.
And to sum up, that's my view as a linguist. I think there are some mechanisms underlying each of the languages of the human languages. So understanding these mechanisms will be letting us to understand how languages work, each of the languages on Earth.
That's very important. And what you said about the neuroplasticity and about the importance of learning every day, I think it's so important to remember about this because some people they're referring to the critical period of language learning and they're saying, so if I didn't learn the language then it's already too late for me to learn any language. But now from neuroscience studies we know that our brain continuously changes and develops new connections, and neuroplasticity lasts for virtually the whole life. So the possibility to learn languages is always there. Maybe not to that extent as in the childhood, but it still exists.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the fact is that, as I said before, adults tend to overthink to rules, to what they consider rules. So do I. I do the same thing when speaking and when writing. When speaking too in this moment, I often think about the structure of the sentence. In Italian, in English, in Russian, I often think about the process of the speaking. It depends anyway on the personality. As by the time we were a child, by the time I was a child, I learned my mother tongue without thinking about rules. And we need to consider that children aren't exposed to a perfect speech. When listening to our parents speaking, talking to us, they don't speak as well as presses as a book does. The books do, a dossier does. No, we are exposed to spontaneous stimuli. Let's just imagine if we were exposed since childhood to a sort of perfect speech language stimuli. It would be weird. We would learn languages as well. Anyway, the most important thing is that when learning languages, we need to learn languages the same way children do, without thinking about overthinking, without overthinking the rule. We can analyze the grammar rules when having a book in our hands, but it is just a fraction, a part of our learning. Learning languages is a cocktail party. I like this definition. It's like a cocktail party in which we are exposed to a lot of confused language stimuli. I often don't understand people speaking so fast in my mother tongue. That's normal. It's absolutely normal. So, language is a dynamic system. Languages are dynamic. We need to adapt to them, and they adapt to us. That's not a static. This I think that's a very important concept. In our childhood, we are not exposed to perfect speech, to stimuli. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like how you are referring to languages as dynamic, alive system, and that we are adapting to it and it adapts to us.
Yeah.
That's I think it's a beautiful interaction actually with the language. Yeah,
A
circular
circular.
interaction.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. In this case, we could say that a circular representation. We could have a circular representation of the time, but a circular representation of the interaction would sound more correct. Maybe it depends on the sense we give to the term correct and incorrect. But the fact is, we don't know whether the time is linear or circular. It depends on just our perception. We don't know. I think it's linear anyway. But anyway, we could represent the interaction between us and the environment and the language as a circle, but also a sphere. Why not? It could be also a sphere. So a three-dimensional view, a representation, and this sphere change over the time. By the time I was a student at university, I used to write, to listen Polish every day. Polish was the second language I studied at university. I would master Polish quite well. as very good as well now, but I tend to think, for instance, in Russian while writing and thinking. While I tend to think in Russian while writing and reading in Polish. So I think that this sphere is a little bit smaller than in the past. It depends on many factors. It depends on many factors, of course. So I would like to insist to keep on underlying this representation, a circular representation, a spherical and a sphere changing his dimension, smaller, bigger. It depends on many factors. Yeah. Through a representation like that, a visual representation, we have the chance to learn things better and get the information stored in the brain, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. For those who want to follow your footsteps, if young beginning students want to get into the field of psycholinguistics, what would you recommend? Where they can start?
To get starting in psycholinguistics, I suggest to start with a bachelor's degree in modern languages or anthropology and adding 2 or 3 psychology exams. For instance, general psychology, developmental psychology, personality psychology, or social psychology, cognitive psychology. A bachelor's degree in psychology would be fine. During my master's degree, I had the chance to pass 3 psychology exams. For instance, general psychology, developmental psychology, and personality. And of course, I would add the psycholinguistics, didactics, linguistics too, in order to get a wide view of languages within and outside us. Since a language, as I said before at the beginning and during our conversation, is something that is involved, a faculty depending on our cerebral mechanisms. So if you want to know about the reason of the presence of past or future tenses, the preposition thanks to which we can concept the idea of the future, the past, it starts from our brain. So I think that personalize, tailor our study plan with 2, 3, or more psychology exams would be very fine and useful. And of course, why not a PhD afterwards?
Thank you so much, Marco. And the last question is, if people want to find you, learn about what you do, what you teach, what you write, where they can find this information.
Yeah, on LinkedIn. I have my own profile on LinkedIn in which I often publish my article about linguistics and psycholinguistics, focusing rational language linguistics and psycholinguistics and cognitive psychology. All of this is involved, concerns the universe, the field of the faculty of language.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We will add this information in our podcast notes so our listeners can contact you or learn more about you. Thank you so much, Marco, for this very, very interesting conversation. And we really dove into this huge sphere of the world of languages. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I like this representation as circle, a sphere, an interaction. Everything is made up of interaction.
Yes, yeah. And thank you so much for this wonderful interaction with me and our listeners. So we appreciate it.
Thank you, Milena, for reaching out and inviting me to this conversation. It was a pleasure.